are well known for their desire to control the message that gets out about them. $650 million to print media buys you a lot of friends. So by throttling back or controlling what we say, what we can see, what we can read, what kind of research we can do, all these sort of things on the internet carries a very chilling feeling to it. Because as somebody much smarter than I am said once, if how did he put it now? Losing, I can win back with the freedom of speech. I can win back. No, I can lose all my rights except the freedom of speech, and with the freedom of speech, I can win them all back again. I believe that's a paraphrase of the quote, but that's the idea. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. That you have now an organization in place, in power, that is so worried about its image that they will do anything and they will say anything to try to keep a happy face on and say, isn't this wonderful? And they try to wrap it up in pretty packages with a little bow on it and say, look, this is harmless. All we want to do is protect heritage. We want to put an end to free speech. That's, as you point out, that's not how you do it. They're going about it backwards. And the danger is, with this legislation, let's assume for the sake of discussion that you're right, that there's nothing about what's going on that's nefarious right now. But what about 10 years from now when you have a new government in place? They could take that law and turn it any way they want to and impose any kind of reading on it they want to. And the next thing you know, all of a sudden, what you couldn't even have imagined is now taking place. So I don't want the government to have this power, even if it's a government I like, because it's too tempting to abuse. The other point I think that's really important is that if by censoring hate speech, what you're really doing is censoring speech, because you mentioned that there are not going to be any black and any this. There's certainly a lot of groups they are very clearly against, and that it would be your white Anglo-Saxon male or people of European descent. There's very little room for the culture that came. They do everything they can. Sometimes either covertly or at least they support it by not prosecuting. I'm thinking of statues of the Queen Victoria or of John A. Macdonald or Winston Churchill being defaced, and the government doesn't do anything about it. Well, if you don't do something about it to protect these institutions, that we have that come from these people or the statues that represent them, then you are implying that you support this kind of activity. And it's this kind of thing that I think is what's really nefarious about this particular point of view. Now, the NDP, and I'll believe this when I say it, have said they're not going to support this. They want to have a legal opinion whether it's constitutional. Well, I can tell you right now, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure out this is not constitutional. That any constitutional lawyer worth his salt is going to say, no, I don't think so. So if that happens and the NDP follow through and refuse to support the Liberals on this piece of legislation, then I will actually stand up and say, well done, Jagmeet Singh, for standing up for Canadian values. It'll probably be the only time I ever do it, but certainly I will give credit where it's due. I just don't think they're going to do it.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've covered a lot of ground there, Nick. And, just a little point of, chalk this up to, or put this into your list of things that you didn't know, but it's interesting to know. Winston Churchill, who is now being attacked for whatever his vilified for his alleged racist and misogynist views, actually founded or was responsible for the original money that went into the building of Churchill College at I don't recall if it's Cambridge or Oxford, but it's a school of science And one of the things that Churchill himself actually stipulated in a time when this was never done was that the college had to have gender balance. In other words, he wanted to encourage women to get an education and go into the sciences. So it kind of gives the lie to the whole argument that Churchill was this terrible misogynist, and amongst other things. He was, a man of his time. But circling back to C10, this particular piece of legislation, well, one of the problems, of course, with the Constitution is that anything is constitutional, and if it's not constitutional, you can still do it in this country by invoking Section 33 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and that is the notwithstanding clause, in order to suspend the Constitution as it applies to that particular piece of legislation. So, it's the argument is whether or not it's constitutional. I laugh when I hear people, talk about that with complete seriousness, because we're not in the United States where the Supreme Court can rule that something is unconstitutional and bang, that's the end of it. We have lots of unconstitutional laws that are put in place in regulations and practices, and in fact, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms only guarantees constitutional rights in this country, more specifically, what it does is it authorizes the government to take action that would normally be interpreted as contravening those rights if the government could justify the contravention in what's called a free and democratic society. So there are a number of tests that the courts could apply in order to make that assessment. But I come back to it again, and that is, what is the point of this type of legislation? You're not going to stop hate, and the way to stop hate, frankly, is well, look, you can't do it anyway. You can't legislate hate away. So the only way that you get rid of bad ideas is by allowing the dissemination of better ideas. And that's something that you can't regulate, because the minute you start regulating it, you're creating the power for the government in the hands of somebody else who perhaps is not as pure-hearted as you are. You're providing them with the power to limit what you and I today would regard to be good speech, because it doesn't fit in with their particular political or social agenda. So, what you have to do, and you can't, I'm going to paraphrase Friedrich Hayek here, because I don't have the quote in front of me, but he said something like this, because people are going to come back and say, well, when the time comes, if there's a problem, we're still going to be in a democracy, we're still going to be able to vote, people out of office, et cetera, et cetera. And Friedrich Hayek pointed out that was a fallacy. And again, I'm paraphrasing, but he said something along the lines of, there's no justification for the belief that power is less arbitrary simply because it's conferred by democratic means. It's the limitation of power, not its source, that makes it less arbitrary. In other words, it's wrong for you to believe that just because a particular government power is subject to democratic controls today, that somehow or other that's going to stop it from being used arbitrarily tomorrow. On the contrary, you could, in theory, have a democracy where people are so kooky and fed up that they're actually going to vote a government in that's going to do nasty things that they ought not to be able to do in the name of the people who voted them in. And so you have to limit the power and not simply rely on the fact that you're going to have votes when the time comes, and that somehow or other the people are going to vote a bad government out of office, or that their legislators, their elected officials, are going to vote against the government to prevent them from doing something. That's just a pipe dream. Pardon my coughing. I should install some kill switches on this. Anyway, that's really... But this is a bad piece of legislation, and ladies and gentlemen, if you're listening to us in Canada, I would recommend that you take the time to get a copy of it. Maybe, Nick will get a copy and post it on our Facebook page. Read it through, and, if you agree with it, fine. But if you disagree with it, get in touch with your member of parliament, whoever he or she happens to be, and tell them that this kind of draconian control of freedom or limitation of freedom of expression, even for positive reasons, does not belong in a country like Canada.
Amen to that.
And with that, Nick, I think we have to go for our final break. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, if you're listening to our show live, stay put, or, get up and stretch your legs, whatever works for you. And if you're listening to the podcast, thanks for joining us. And be sure to tune in tomorrow morning for part 4 of this week's episode of the Nick and Joe Show on ThinkRadio.ca.